Thanks everybody for being here at our annual seed swap and making the journey in this weather. It wasn't too bad, but it could have been better. Uh, so yeah, we've got a great presentation here today. We've got Steve Sass and Amanda Smith. And they are, I told them I'd just do a really quick introduction. They've done so much amazing work for conservation in Indiana, throughout the state of Indiana. It's hard to encapsulate it in a brief introduction, but they have done a huge amount of work in community building and just advocacy and awareness. They are both expert in their field of just all things Indiana nature. They'll probably talk about their organization and that. So yeah, just enjoy this talk and have all the questions for them. Okay, so here you go.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming out on this cold, wintry day. We're excited to be here. It's my first time ever to be at this event, and Amanda's first time at this event also. So this program that we're going to be presenting for you, which hopefully will entertain you somewhat, is entitled, as you can see, Trees and Shrubs Through an Ecological Lens. And even though this is a seed swap, and most of the seeds that you probably have out there aren't of the seeds of woody plants, that's primarily what we're going to be talking about during this presentation. And as I was putting together this presentation, we've done this one a couple of times now, I was driving and listening to the radio, and there was this NPR segment on. This was, maybe about a year ago or so. It was entitled, "Where Have All the Butterflies Gone?" And there was a guest that was on, it was Science Friday, and the guest was from Michigan State University, and they had just finished compiling this study looking at the various means of tracking butterfly populations in North America. So there are a number of different organizations that go out in the field and they do butterfly survey work. And the results of this study, which looked at the culmination of all of these various field surveys, was that butterflies were in serious decline. In fact, they had made the comment that for every 5 butterflies that were present in the year 1999, now we have only 4 of those 5. So we've lost roughly 1 out of every 5 butterflies, I'm talking about individuals, since the last 25 years or so. So this was kind of alarming, and it was tied to this study that we see over there on the right-hand side. And you've probably, anybody's been paying attention to what's going on in the natural world, realizes that it's not just butterflies that we're losing, right? We're losing lots of different insects. This was a graph from a study from 2019 that shows the various declines of different insect orders, with butterflies being really close to the top next to caddisflies. So, and they make this kind of a shocking statement that total global insect population decline has been 41% over just the last decade. And insects are extremely important. We can't survive on Earth as humans without having a healthy insect population.
We did not include a food web slide because we're not all in elementary school, but we learned that at the time about how the food web works, or food pyramid, ecologically. So when the insects, which is one of the bases really just above the plants, start to decline, everything that feeds on insects then starts to decline. So it's not surprising to see that our reptiles, amphibians are starting also to see measured decline. And then our birds. So birds, of course, more recently have been very well tied through Doug Talame and others, how important insects are to bird species, and we're seeing massive declines with birds as well.
This was a study that the National Audubon Society released 2 or 3 years ago. This one made pretty well national, if not international, headlines, that they have concluded that we have 2.9 less 2.9 billion less birds than we had in 1970. So we're losing nature at a pretty alarming rate. Particularly some of these grassland birds that are declining because we don't have grassland habitat anymore. But certainly across a range of habitats. This was that's Doug Tallamy when he was at a event in St. Joseph County a year ago. But he quoted this statistic from the London School of Economics and Political Science. So they say globally at least 1.2 million plant and animal species are estimated to be under threat of extinction, many of them before 2100. So we have a lot of concern with losing the other animals that we share planet Earth with because we depend on them for our own survival. And if we look at the reasons for habitat decline, or excuse me, the reasons for loss of biodiversity, we always see these four things listed, typically in this order, with habitat loss being right there at the top. And I think for a lot of us, we tend to think of habitat loss in terms of pictures like what we see here of far off places. On the left-hand side, that's deforestation in the Yucatan Peninsula, and top right is clearing a forest for agriculture in Borneo, and down in the bottom right is logging in Madagascar. So I think my point with this, or our point with this, is that we tend to think of these sorts of things as happening in far off places and not in our own backyards, but that's absolutely not the case, as evidenced by this slide, which is pre-European settlement amount of virgin forest that we had in the United States. Almost the entirety of the eastern United States was forested. And this is that similar map of what we had left in 1926. Indiana was settled in the 1830s primarily, and you can see in less than 90 years we had deforested almost all of Indiana except for a couple of little spots. And there's repercussions for doing this, certainly. It comes with the loss of the species that depend on these habitats to survive. So this is a photo of what we would consider a relatively healthy looking woods in Indiana, which we have very few remaining of anymore. It's not a first growth or an old growth forest, but you can tell by the size of the trees. But it's still a pretty functional ecosystem. And the problem is that nowadays when we have places like this, we typically tend to turn them into places like this. They become prime places for building homes and doing residential developments. And I think we could do these in such a way. I mean, first of all, protecting our land is really paramount to everything, conserving what we have left. But there are good ways and there are bad ways to do these sorts of development. So this was a photograph just outside of South Bend at a development. We can kind of see that the foreground of it is heavily disturbed, and they've obviously cleared everything and probably bulldozed the soil. But in the back, we still have some of that functional habitat. We can see some sycamore trees and some mayaples on the ground. But this is typically what we do to it, and that's that same subdivision. And there's a famous quote from the naturalist Aldo Leopold where he said the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to save all of the parts. Here we've virtually thrown away all of the parts, and we don't know any better, right,
Yeah.
Amanda? I mean,
and typically, not only obviously the plant material's gone, the wildlife and biodiversity represented therein, but also the soil. The topsoil is generally scraped and sold. So it's just a massive scar that we do.
We've all seen this.
Yeah,
right? We can all relate to this picture, I think.
And most of what they take, a lot of it at least, is commodity, so it's sold and distributed in other places, but it can never be really rebuilt the way it was.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction too. Is I think from a societal standpoint, we tend to think of ecosystems as things that we can restore and we can fix and we can rebuild and we can make well again. But we might be able to put together things that kind of look like what they used to be, but there's a lot that we don't understand about the functionality of these ecosystems that gets destroyed when we do things like this. So this was a home building site, and I took this picture. This was another house. This was not that same subdivision, but it's another one outside of South Bend. This was a real house. It's maybe a couple of miles from where I live. And I keep thinking that eventually somebody, if I show this house, somebody who owns this house is going to eventually show up at one of the programs. I'll be like, oh no. But I use this slide to kind of illustrate, like, this is sort of your typical Midwestern American moderate cost new house, right? And so I took this picture of this house thinking, I bet I know what they're going to do with it landscaping-wise. And so we put together, with the use of some photo editing software, some things that we would think that we would typically do with something like this, right? So the builder,
maybe not those of us in the room, but we
right.
in society here in Indiana.
The builder hands you the keys to the house and says, here you go, and then maybe you're going to call a landscape company, or maybe you're going to go down to the Home Depot or what have you and buy some plants. And of course, the first thing that we thought we would put in is a Colorado blue spruce tree over on the right-hand side, because people love evergreen trees. It's, you know, obviously not an Indiana native species, but they also want to have maybe some blocking for their neighbor from their neighbors and some privacy. So we put that tree in there and aged it a few years, obviously. Then maybe we want a specimen tree for our front lawn, and so we added this guy. That's a calorie pear tree, a Pyrus caloriana. Hey, it was the urban forestry tree of the year in like 2006. So we were planting a lot of these trees along our city streets and sidewalks. So
It's still legal to plant in our state. So
it is. Yeah, we're not doing. And then over on the left-hand side of the garage, we put in a Crimson King Norway maple, which is a European maple tree that's known for having the red foliage, because for some reason we like red foliage trees, I guess. So we see a lot of those, obviously, going in. And then we got to have some shrubs along our foundation, and so we put in some burning bush.
Oh,
Burning bush, some euonymus there to kind of cover up our foundation and give us that lovely red fall color that we like.
I've done landscape tending and love the way landscapers landscape stuff that needs lots of tending.
Yeah, well, over on the left-hand side of the garage, we added another shrub, and that's our contribution to wildlife. That's a buddleia, or a butterfly bush. And then, which is native to Asia and not Indiana. And then in the front here, we put in some hostas to dress up our mailbox, and then we trimmed the grass from the driveway. And this is what we wound up with, was, you know, in the area that we destroyed America, and those sycamore trees and the mayaples and what have you. And we've replaced it with mostly Chinese and European foliage. And the problem with doing this is that we now have a landscape that is functionally barren. It's not supporting our local ecosystems.
not only that, but there's at least 3 invasive species that are named in our state. So not only is it sterile to this yard, but it's harming other ecosystems nearby.
Which ones are invasive?
The maple, the crimson maple, Norway maple,
Calorie pear,
pear.
the
Actually, maybe 4.
the burning bush, and then potentially the butterfly bush,
Yeah.
which, yes, ma'am. Yeah, no.
Again,
they're-
those 2 species are ones that are still legal to sell in the state. I think crimson.
no, that's still. They're all
It's
still
Norway.
legal to
So,
be sold.
but it was the horticultural trade that really blocked the rule change in Indiana. So those are still being able to be sold, and people are making money off of these things still today. So.
And then this was the entrance to that subdivision where I took that picture. And I thought, you know, again, they hired the developer. Probably doesn't hate America. They they're like everybody did, and they called the landscape company, and the landscape company brought in the nursery plants. And so I took this picture, and I thought, oh, it'd be interesting to see where these plants. I don't know why we seems like we've got more flags than we should have. Maybe not. No, I guess that's right.
Yeah, so if we were to put a flag from the country of origin in front of most of our landscape plants, it could help to kind of help us key into the fact that we're not dressing things and with at least patriotism or local ecological patriotism.
And the one plant that does have the American flag is a Coreopsis that's native to the southeastern United States. So essentially, we've thrown away all of the parts of what used to be Portage Woods, and we've replaced it with what you see here.
And the earlier slide, the Colorado blue spruce, is an American native tree, but native to Colorado, so not to Indiana
area. And so, we looked at this. We did some extensive research a few years ago on the nursery trade and the beginnings of the nursery trade, and the sort of like, how did we get here? How did we arrive at this destination? And amazingly, the story goes all the way back to colonial North America. And on the left-hand side is John Bartram, who was a early American plantsman. He was actually he founded the first nursery in the United States called Bartram Gardens in Philadelphia. If you've been to Philadelphia, Bartram Gardens is still there. John Bartram. And it's a historical property, and you can go and tour it. And Bartram was an importer of plants. He was also an exporter of plants. So as the European settlers arrived to North America, they liked to have the plants that they knew from back home. It made them feel less detached from their homeland. That's how we got a lot of things, tulips and daffodils, and not everything causes problems, obviously. But a lot of those plants came over around that same time. But also there was a great hunger from the Europeans for North American plants. And so Bartram was taking our plants and sending them over to Europe at the same time. We didn't know any better. We didn't realize that there was potentially would be problems associated with this. We looked at the moving of plants around the world as being a good thing. And we did that for a couple hundred years probably, really. I think it's only been until the last maybe 50 years or less before we've started to realize the damage that was done by that.
But there's still a real desire to bring in the new thing, to have something that the neighbor doesn't have, or that grows prettier, bigger, more heads to their flower, all of the things. You'll see it all the time if you haven't already looked for it.
The painting on the right-hand side is George Washington visiting Bartram Gardens, and both Washington and Thomas Jefferson were clients of Bartram, and they've of course had their estates at Mount Vernon and Monticello, and a lot of the plants that they planted around there came from Bartram around that time period. Jefferson was really, I think, a very amazing person in American history, a very interesting person, certainly, and that's his estate at Monticello there. He was, obviously our third president. He was governor of Virginia. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was ambassador to France. He served as vice president. He did a tremendous amount of things politically in his career, but towards the end of his life, he wrote in his memoirs that really the thing that gave him the most joy in life was gardening, and if he could have
planetarium on plantation. Have you ever been there?
I have not been there. Have you been there?
Bigger than that, unless that's it. He had a bigger than that building, greenhouse planetarium, all full of plants.
Yeah. Yeah, he imported a lot of things, and a lot of the things that he imported were not so good either. And we can actually trace some of the some well-known exotic invasive plants directly to Jefferson. Periwinkle or myrtle, Vinca minor, is one plant that Jefferson was the first known person to plant.
So add to the list of things, he's also a slave owner, so mentioning that. So complicated person historically, especially as we look back. But this sort of desire for a menagerie, this was happening with zoology, zoo animals as well, coming in from different places. But a plant menagerie from around the world is something that Jefferson was also aspiring to and achieved on his property.
And speaking of zoo animals, that kind of ties into our next slide here. Where we're trying to rationalize the behavior of these people and why they were doing what they were doing with seemingly bringing in things that would be causing ecological damage without understanding or referencing that. And there was a common belief at the time that extinction was impossible. And it was more of a theological belief than a scientific belief. The reasoning was that and Jefferson was one of the people who subscribed to this theory, was that God created the earth perfectly, and the loss of just one of the parts would cause a complete collapse of the earth. So therefore, everything had to still remain out there somewhere. So this is Lewis and Clark in the top right painting, and Jefferson famously told Lewis and Clark, as they were about to leave on their expedition, to keep their eyes out for mastodons. We had mastodon skeletons at that point, so Jefferson believed that there must be mastodons, and so that was one of the things he was most excited about on the Lewis and Clark expedition, was to have them go looking for the missing mastodons that he knew were out there somewhere. And there's actually the giant ground sloth, which is an extinct animal named after Jefferson. But Jefferson later conceded at the end of his life, after Lewis and Clark didn't turn up any mastodons, he wrote in a letter to John Adams that, well, maybe I was wrong and maybe extinction is possible, because he had pretty well given up on finding some of these things alive again. Arbor Day. So Arbor Day is coming up in a few months, and that's like one of the most innocuous holidays that's out there, sort of. I mean, we don't have to do much to celebrate it, right? Plant a tree, maybe. We don't have to cook. We don't have to have relatives over to the house and that sort of. We don't have to buy presents for people, so it's kind of an easy one. And it's like one of those things that like everybody every Arbor Day story that you see on the news is like a happy story. It's like, come on out to Arbor Day and plant a tree, and trees are good, and everything is rosy about Arbor Day. But Arbor Day had some pretty dubious beginnings to it, and that's Sterling Morton on the left-hand side, or on the right-hand side of the slide here. He was the head of USDA for a while. His son started the Morton Arboretum over in Lisle, Illinois. But he was the kind of the father of Arbor Day, and he was, by all accounts, a really terrible person. He was an anti-abolitionist, and even after the Civil War, he fought to keep blacks from having the same rights as white people do, and he was just kind of a nasty guy. He had a pretty wife, though. I don't remember what her name was, but he definitely married above his skill level there. Anyway, so Arbor Day started in 1872, and the reason why, and Arbor Day, if you ever looked into Arbor Day, it's like it started in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I always thought, what? That's a strange place for Arbor Day to have started. But the reason why it originated out of Lincoln, Nebraska, was that Morton lived out there, and he believed that the North American plains didn't have enough shade.
Yeah.
Like let that sink in for a minute. We're talking about the North American prairie, which is now like functionally extinct, except for little remnants here and there. He looked at that as being a really bad thing. All this big grassland, we need to have more shade. He also thought we needed to have more fruit trees. And so supposedly in that first Arbor Day, they planted 1 million trees out on the North American plains. So we haven't always done wise things in this country. I think that's one of the things that's kind of a recurring thing that we talk about here, right? Did you want to add anything else to that one? So yeah, this is what this was the Dust Bowl was what culminated from decades of poor agricultural practices. Out in the 1930s, we had decades of people who came out, who moved to the West from the East, who didn't know how to farm, who didn't know how to take care of soil. They plowed up the native prairie. And then couple that with a historic drought, and we had the Dust Bowl. And this was a picture of the worst day of the Dust Bowl, which was known as Black Sunday, and it was so dark that that people thought literally that the world was coming to an end. It was so horrific.
I can talk on this one. So this one of the few photographs they have of the prairie, at least in this form. It was so undervalued that it really wasn't even worth a lot of historical documentation. It was good, considered potentially good farmland, but as evident, it could be improved. So Morton and others looked at this vast openness of prairie not as an ecologically stable community that had essentially sort of fortified a very harsh area with plants and wildlife, but they saw it as an obstacle, and with inventions to the plow and things, they could actually break through the massive topsoil that was there and get through the roots. And this photo is a good illustration, at least, of what they were up against, but then what we had essentially manufactured to break through it. But they just did not really obviously value it and looked at it as something to improve.
Well, right. In this photo, this is a post-Dust Bowl photograph where we have big blue stem grass, Andropogon gerardii, that's holding, literally, it's the only thing that's holding the soil together. And you see that the only place that the soil is held together is where the roots of that plant are growing. Everything else has been blown away. And the Dust Bowl was so bad that clouds of dust moved over Chicago all the way out to the East Coast, Washington, D.C. That's when the politicians finally decided to get involved, when they saw the black clouds coming overhead on over Washington, D.C. and moving out into the Atlantic Ocean. So they realized that they had a problem that they needed to fix. And and actually, in our next slide, there's a picture of the Dust Bowl over that's what the Jefferson, Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And people left. People just packed up and left. This was Woody Guthrie was very famous, well-known person at that time who sang about the Dust Bowl. And the people who lived out in the plains just had nothing left, no other reason left to stay there. So they moved to California and other places. And so we knew we needed to fix it. And as the recurring theme goes, we didn't necessarily fix it right. You want to talk about this one?
The Shelter Belt Project was, so the WPA and then the Soil Service become active during this time, the Forest Service as well, and there was an effort to essentially fix the plains with trees and with other, what was standardly kind of thought of as good ecological technology or at least engineering with different projects. So planting more trees in this case, and the Chinese Siberian elm is one that is planted quite a bit. What's fascinating to me, though, is that we assume that we can probably bring in other plants, but the plants that we removed were not thought of as a good option to bring back in. So we go to other things, in most cases, plants that have evolved on other continents.
Yeah, the USDA at that point became very active in sending agents, actually before the Dust Bowl, back as far as the 1890s, sending agents over to Eastern Asia to try to find plants that would benefit North American ecology, and that's how we got a calorie pear came over at that time, for instance, but it wasn't really introduced until much later on. But the Siberian elm tree was, as according to their statistic, was 75% of the trees that they planted in the North American plains to try to serve as a windbreak, so we wouldn't have the Dust Bowl reoccurring. But as Amanda said, instead of putting back the prairie plants with their deep roots, we looked to overseas to try to fix the problem. And naturally that didn't work. But these are some USDA pamphlets that showcase mostly woody plants these are from the 1950s and the 1960s that they were recommending that people plant in the U.S.
Yeah, so multiflora rose, what's this one there?
Paul Fescue, this
Yeah.
is, which one was the one on the right-hand side? Did we cut it off or something, didn't
Yeah,
we?
I don't remember that one, but all invasive species as identified now. But these were recommended to farmers, and
Autumn olive, I think, is what
autumn
that
olive.
was, yeah.
And I guess Steve and I, for whatever reason, maybe don't always go with the status quo, even from our experts. I think because in part we should have realized we should question experts too, and start to kind of just ask more questions and to learn a bit more about the science involved.
Yeah, and again, I think the prevailing thought was that we could move plants around the globe and there would be no repercussions for doing so, and that Asia had valuable plants that we could use that would help our mostly agriculture. We were an agrarian society in these days, and so we were first and foremost, we were thinking about agriculture and benefits to agriculture. And as you can see from these pamphlets, they're really all agriculture related.
But I also think the prevailing kind of wisdom of the time and what we still see today is, I think, of an immigrant community that assumes that the plants here are weeds and we have better plants where we came from, or what has now been exploited, in this case, Asia and other places. So
here's I forgot we had some other ones put in here also. There's autumn olive and the sweet clovers, which are still condoned by beekeepers, I guess, that can be quite invasive. Bicolor lespedeza. So these are all USDA pamphlets. So this wasn't just people doing stuff on their own. The government was telling them, plant this and it will solve problems and create others. So we put this slide in. Ecology really is unbelievably a very young science, even though it has roots that go back to antiquity, all the way back to Aristotle and some of the other Greek philosophers who started to make the connections that things in the world were connected more so than what we were realizing. But it really wasn't until, and back in those days, they called those people natural philosophers, because what they were, the ideas that they were coming up with couldn't be proven because we didn't have the scientific equipment to be able to demonstrate it yet. But that didn't take place for much longer until we started having inventions like the telescope, where we could see far off places, and the microscope, where we could see very, very small things that were able to prove that some of these earlier theories were indeed correct. But then you don't really have much of anything in terms of teaching the interconnectedness until really the late 1800s or so, mid to late 1800s, and people like Alexander von Humboldt traveled the world, and he made the connection that plants that grew in the temperate zone of Germany are similar to the plants that grow in the temperate zone of North America, and so therefore there must be some sort of connectivity to this. So this is, I think, part of the reasoning why we've made such bad choices in the past. We didn't really look at the world as being interconnected. We didn't necessarily think that the plant that we plant is influencing the insects that are in our ecosystem, and ultimately the other things that that eat the insects and so on. This was a picture of Hoosier Prairie over in northwest Indiana in Lake County. It's a remnant piece of our natural grassland. This is really more of a savanna habitat. We don't have very many of these left anymore, which is why they are globally endangered. But this is a picture of what would be a functioning ecosystem. And an ecosystem we can define as being a unit that consists of both an abiotic and biotic components. So we have influences such as the sun and the soil and the wind that would be the abiotic influencers, and then of course the plants and all the other animals that live in this ecosystem are the biotic influencers. And I think, did you say we weren't going to talk about the food web? We are going to talk about the food web. So this would be kind of an example of the food web that we would expect to find in that Hoosier Prairie ecosystem, where we have the producers, which would be, in this case, we singled out, that's a black oak, Quercus velutina. And on the left-hand side, along with its leaves and its acorn with the green circles as being the producers. So the producers are able to take energy from the sun and convert it into sugars and oxygen and support everything else up from that on the food chain, including the squirrels that eat the acorns and the grasshopper sparrow that eats the tussock moth caterpillar that was eating the leaves, and then we have the Cooper's hawk that would be the top level consumer that would eat the birds, and perhaps the squirrel that would be eating it. So this is our interconnectivity, right? So, and it's all based on this ecosystem. It all starts with that woody tree over there, that black oak, native tree, huge wildlife value, very, very important. So what would happen then if we were to replace that black oak with, say, this ginkgo biloba, the ginkgo tree, which is from China, and you can see the ginkgo leaves. Well, we don't have the caterpillar anymore in that ecosystem, or the grasshopper sparrow that eats the caterpillar, because the caterpillar can't make use of the ginkgo leaves. We don't have the acorn because ginkgo trees, of course, we plant only the male ones because the females make the stinky fruit. So we don't have any fruit at all, let alone something that's usable like the acorns. So there's nothing for the squirrel to eat anymore. And because there's no birds and squirrels, we lose our top level consumers in the hawk. So the only thing left in this ecosystem is the decomposer, the fungi, and then the producer. You can have this one.
So on the slide here, we have two sets of trees. We have a oak. Is it a red oak on the? That's
your
on the
picture,
right?
I think.
Okay,
actually,
I'll say red oak.
You should know.
And then we have the calorie pair on the other side. So obviously there's leaf shape differences and different things, but the big thing that we notice right away are the holes in the leaves. The calorie pair will look, for those of you that have it potentially still in your neighborhood, hopefully not in your yard, but it looks great. It looks like you could buy it from Target and it would be plastic and would look about the same as it would be outside. Whereas our natives, especially oaks, are going to show a lot of insect activity and just can be scary looking to a lot of folks when they see, because there's still a knee-jerk reaction for a lot of people to see a leaf with holes in it and think, ooh, something's not right with my tree. It's diseased, or it's got problems or pests. So this is something to look for in your yard.
The calorie pear tree, I pulled over the car. There was a big infestation of these in South Bend. I stopped and I just took a picture of it, and then I looked. As I was looking, and I'm going, there's not one single hole in any of these leaves. Nothing is eating this plant. It's not supporting anything in the ecosystem.
I think Ptolemy's research has shown, he says 0 to maybe 2 species of caterpillar will eat the calorie pear leaf, at least now. They could evolve potentially to start eating the calorie pear, but that's in geologic time. And that's not in a couple 10 years. That will take many years for these insects to adapt to a new plant. Whereas your oaks are going to famously host probably 500, potentially, depending on the species, different types, different species of moth and butterfly caterpillar.
And so the problem with this is that, from a gardening standpoint, and my grandmother was an avid rose gardener, and she used a lot of pesticides to keep her roses from being beaten by Japanese beetles and whatever else. And Japanese beetles are kind of a bad example because that is an exotic invasive pest that we have to kind of deal with. But for the most part, when you see something like this, there's not going to be any damage to your tree. And people really get uptight about the webworms, the fall webworms and the spring
Cankerworms.
spring cankerworms,
Yeah.
right? Which
Bagworms.
well, they're not bagworms,
No,
but people
but
call them
they call 'em
bagworms.
bagworms.
Right. So the point with those is that those are native insects that typically do not, unless the tree is already stressed or damaged, are not going to harm the tree. But we have an obsession with cutting them out and burning them and spraying them and doing that sort of thing, which brings us then to our next reason for biodiversity loss, and that's pesticides. And boy, everybody, I look at these pictures, and I know you all can smell what that aisle is like in the store. Like you walk down that aisle and you're like, oof.
It's worse than Christmas.
What?
It's worse than the Christmas smell.
So, we typically go running to chemicals to try to solve the problems with having holes in leaves, which many times aren't even problems. And another thing is are these mosquito services, which have really exponentially increased, it seems, over the past few years. And the chemicals that these guys are spraying are not selective only to just mosquitoes. They're killing a lot of things that are in our ecosystem. So
It's also a crock. Yeah, you can't get rid. I mean,
it's
it's
right.
just-
Controlling if you're out to control mosquitoes, trying to kill the adults is the least efficient way of doing it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So the mosquito joes in the world are, and actually more importantly, probably the consumers that are paying these folks to come in are unknowingly, in many cases, like my neighbor, who's a sweet gal, but she hires these companies to come in. So it's killing any really insect within that canopy in that time, and things that we obviously don't realize that are there, but this is a spicebush swallowtail caterpillar. And just to give you a good idea, so when you have either the sassafras or the spicebush in your yard, you're essentially providing habitat for the caterpillar. And the spicebush caterpillar, if you are to look around for it, starts off, they have 5 instars, 5 different, essentially like growth cycles as caterpillars. The first 2, they're going to look a little bit like bird poop, and but they also, you can kind of find them on your shrubs, or at least know that they've been there, because the little guys especially will make kind of a little sleeping bag. They generally are more active at night, and then they roll up during the day, and they attach a little bit of silk and then just kind of roll in there. But if you are careful and kind of want to peek in, you may find it in there.
Right there.
Occasionally, though, once those sleeping bags are empty, spiders could move in. So a lot of times I'll open it, and I kind of scream sometimes if it's a spider, but it is still really fun. As they get bigger, then they make more of a kind of a taco burrito sort of situation where they're very large. So but yeah, keep an eye out for these. But these chemicals are impacting these insects. And these holes in these leaves, in many cases, is a very healthy sign. So helping people understand that they shouldn't just run to a chemical. One of the things, I work at a nature center, actually, I didn't say, but in central Indiana, and constantly helping people kind of navigate their yards, and especially when they've gone native, and then they're like, wait a minute, I didn't like all these bugs or all this stuff. So helping them understand. But one of my first advice is know what you're killing before you kill it. Identify it. Understand what it is. Is it bad? Is it good? How can I help? Do you have a good photo? And then second, before you just go and do it or hire it out, be sure you're getting advice from someone who's not profiting from the answer they give you. And so I would be an example of someone who doesn't profit, aside from maybe a healthier community, in that advice. So something I try to tell people a lot.
So, well, we're under tremendous marketing, right, to have to use these products, and if we don't have a perfect lawn, you're kind of considered to be a bad neighbor in Midwestern or Eastern North America, anyway. So we're gonna have to keep moving along here because we're running out of time. We got a lot to get through, but we've all seen these advertisements. The weird mutant butterfly that's kind of like half monarch and half swallowtail up there, and the
Yeah,
idea that
I took that photo in the Carmel area in central Indiana, and I would have loved to have been a fly or a butterfly on the wall of the marketing group who's thought, monarchs aren't pretty enough, and tiger swallowtails, eastern tiger swallowtails, let's just morph them together and make some sort of chemically mutant butterfly. But it's marketed in many cases to be safe for dogs and children, and research shows that it most likely is not.
the irony here, where down here it says, keep your kids and pets and whatever off of and then over here they're like,
Yeah.
your dog will be happy.
Yeah, and
and your kids will
the
love
kids are
it.
looking in the yard and the grass, and I'm like, they're not finding anything in that grass. Like, what? What are
This
they
was
looking for?
this was a Joe Pyeweed eupatorium that I took a picture of in my backyard a few years ago. This was like in June, and I'm like, wow, something's really eating up this plant. But I didn't go running for the ortho problem solver, the chemicals. I just left it alone, and then a month later, here's an eastern tiger swallowtail. It's the exact same plant, and it's just fine. It didn't harm it in the least. In fact, it was supporting insects of some sort. I never did figure out exactly what was eating it, but
Joe Pye, generally as a genus, is one of the second, I think, to solid. The goldenrod group is one of the highest producers for, or hosts. It hosts many different species of caterpillars.
asters.
Yeah, asters are up
Asters
there
is
too.
Oh,
but
okay.
yeah.
I mean, you said goldenrod and Joe Pye, but they're both asters.
Right, but the genus it has
Eupatorium.
a high host rate, I guess.
So that's not to say that all of these insects are not beneficial. And here's a couple that are legitimate pests, and they're legitimate pests because they weren't part of our ecosystem. They were imported, and they came over here without natural enemies, and now they are problematic to us. That's the emerald ash borer on the left-hand side, which has effectively killed all of our mature ash trees in eastern North America, and then the Japanese beetles, which are known very well to gardeners, which brings us to introduced species and pathogens as another reason for the decline of biodiversity. And we can define an invasive species as something that's not native to our ecosystem, it's exotic to our ecosystem, and it's causing harm. That's the USDA definition of it.
Yeah. However, when you start to look at it, generally harm is commercial harm. So it's impacting.
Can be, yeah.
For the most part, most of our truly invasive species are listed because they have that they're harming, whether it's agriculture or timber commodities.
So back to our house example again, this is kind of where we left off with, we mentioned that there were 3 invasive things here, and really essentially everything that you see in this picture is exotic. But some of them are certainly causing harm, like the Callery pear tree. This was by you and Carmel, is this? Or
it's
something
the
like that?
Noblesville Westfield Carmel corridor.
Okay.
So
I call it the Callery pear corridor.
yeah, and what's infuriating to me is these were all planted with taxpayer dollars. So
Yep.
this was a street tree.
And these photos are also from the same county, and this is as a result. These are, I wouldn't call them natural areas, they're old fields, but you can clearly see the impact of
And
these
I'd
plants.
say old field is where you go back to the grassland birds, that kind of scrub habitat that is important, but it gets the politicians locally upset because it looks abandoned. That habitat's actually really valuable for some of the birds that we see massive declines on, and now we're seeing these Callery pear move in.
We had Norway maple in our planting there, and here's a Norway maple on the left-hand side that's planted at Pinhook Park in South Bend. We can see on the right-hand side where that was purposefully planted by the city forestry there. And on the left-hand side, you can see that same color, that tone of leaves are very distinctive
Like a
in the
neon.
spring, that kind of neon green. And that's on the left-hand side is the banks of the St. Joe River, where that tree is now completely taken over there. And this is the same park. I took a picture of the seeds below that tree, and they make copious amounts of seeds, which you can see. So here's our burning bush, right? This was a burning bush infestation in a natural area, and these are not uncommon in our area, and they're super easy to spot in the fall when they turn red.
One of the things we hear a lot from people, it's natural, I know I do it, is when you've been told you've done something wrong is to get defensive, and I see that a lot with people with invasive species. But one of the common retorts we hear is, it's not invasive in my yard, so it must not be problematic. And people, again, that's a clear indication that educationally they just do not understand how these plants move.
Unless you're shooting all of the birds that come into your yard, they're gonna spread them for you, right? And we talked about butterfly bush. That's kind of an early problematic species. It's in this the map. You can see the green areas are counties that have documented occurrences of butterfly bush having escaped cultivation and moved into natural areas. So there are a few places in Indiana. Out on the West Coast, Oregon and Washington have both officially declared it to be an invasive plant. And trees are like a really super popular topic right now. And under the Biden administration, the U.S. government invested $1.5 billion into community urban forestry. And so we've planted a ton of trees, and a lot of cities in Indiana, including Goshen, and Elkhart and South Bend, got sizable amounts of money to be able to increase their urban canopy. So we're planting a lot of trees, which makes this a really relevant topic. We need to make sure that we're planting the right trees. And we go into like sustainability field, we'll typically talk about the values of trees, but they don't normally talk about ecology as being one of the top values of trees. We talk about the urban heat effect and shade and air pollution and things like that, but we're not seeing like biodiversity necessarily mentioned here like we should be. This is another slide that kind of talks about the same thing, but canopy cover is another thing too. And we've heard a lot of cities and towns will have these canopy cover goals. So there is an organization, who was it that came out with that? The canopy cover thing was, the name of the organization who recommended it escapes me. But a lot of cities have made this their goal to have a 40% canopy coverage in their city. And the organization that came out with that number has since, I think, wisely rescinded it, because ecology doesn't work on that simple of an aspect where we can just say, yep, 40% everywhere. Like in northern Indiana, we had grasslands, and we had beech maple forests, and we had oak woodlands, and we had swamps and marshes and lots of different ecosystems, and they all had varying amounts of tree canopy, and they all had different tree species that would have been part of that. So American Forest, there you go. That was the organization that no longer recommends the 40% canopy goal. But we see like lots of pictures like this with trees, and I'm going back to Arbor Day and why tree planting and Arbor Day tends to be like a really happy holiday. The little child tamping the tree down, but we never see like pictures of this, which is what I see all over the place. And we all see this. And this time of year, tree lines. A farmer may have a little tree line that's providing a little bit of habitat, but it's also areas that aren't being able to be used for crops, and so a lot of those are being taken out.
Yeah, and there's a lot of campaigns out there that plant 1 million and 1 billion, trees, and they're putting trees in the Amazon. But my question is, what trees? What species of tree are you putting in? My dad passed away last year, and you could make a donation, and it could go to the Arbor Day Foundation. And I had a couple aunts and uncles that did that, and I thought, I should have put out a thing that said don't, because a lot of the trees that they're planting, I don't support. Planting those in the right ecosystem, sure, but generally that's not always been well researched.
Yeah, archaic planning ordinances is another kind of a pet peeve of mine. This is a commercial development in South Bend. It's a fire station, and they built the fire station on what was an oak savanna or an oak barrens ecosystem, and we've been nursing this ecosystem back, and you can see it's just beautiful. There's black oak saplings, and there's lanceolate coreopsis, and there's prickly pear cactus, and all of these things that we would find in these native remnant habitat. But the county says, nope, you're building a commercial development, you've got to put 50 trees in there. Well, this habitat would not have supported 50 trees in the first place. That's too many trees for this, but that's the do-goodness of the county planning, thinking that they're helping by forcing people to plant this many trees, even though they really didn't need to be. It's more detrimental to plant that many trees. And then, genetic diversity is another really big issue to me. And we see a lot of these cultivar trees that are being planted and sold at nurseries. And nurseries can make money selling the cultivar trees. They're patented, and they demand a higher price tag. So in this case, anytime you see a tree or a shrub that has like that name in single quotes, it's a cultivated variety of the tree. Now the problem with that is that cultivated trees are propagated vegetatively instead of sexually through seed, meaning that every single one of these Acer rubrum Frank's red sunset trees that's sold in the entire world is genetically identical. So when we're talking about sustainability, we're trying to make our cities more resilient to climate change, to exotic invasive species, whatever, introduce pathogens. Genetic diversity is important. We don't want to have everything be exactly the same, because one single pathogen could come in and wipe them all out. This was a Doug Tallamy quote about that, where he mentioned that we know it's not a good idea to reduce genetic diversity. This was the South Bend had a master tree planting list, and Amanda and I vetted it a few years ago. So this was a book that South Bend comes up with, or a pamphlet that lists all of the trees that they recommend for planting within the city limits. And we went through and we found that 64% of them were actually genetic clones. So.
And it goes back again to the early kind of colonial idea that these plants are coming in, or we're still planting them for aesthetic reasons. So when you look at these clones, the Frank's red, which could be Frankenstein red, I mean essentially, but these are they're planting the qualities of these trees for the main reason is aesthetics and ease of maintenance. It's all very anthropomorphically driven.
They're bred the way they are for our purposes, our uses, and not for their contribution to ecology. This was a study that came out in the American Journal of Botany a couple of years ago, where the author makes the claim that we're actually making our cities less sustainable by planting these trees than more sustainable. So we're achieving the opposite goal of what we're setting out to do. This was my own personal story about genetics. That's me at probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old, 10 years old, maybe something like that. My grandfather had a blueberry farm, and there was a variety of blueberry called Stanley that was subject to this blueberry mosaic ophiovirus. And every one of the Stanley blueberry bushes turned into this wilted leaf-looking sort of thing, and they all died, and they had to remove like 2 acres of Stanley because Stanleys were cultivated varieties of blueberries that were susceptible to that particular virus. So I'm not suggesting that we do away with cultivated varieties in agriculture, because Gala apples and Honey Crisp and all those things are all genetically the same. But in terms of building our ecosystems, we need to have as much genetic diversity as possible. This was a street in South Bend that's planted with the Princeton elm, which is a Dutch elm disease-resistant elm cultivar, which is fine, except they planted like the entire street in them, which makes no sense at all. And then lastly, climate change is typically the fourth thing that we'll talk about in terms of the loss of biodiversity. And the reason we bring this up is we have a lot of people who do tree plantings that say, well, the scientists are predicting that within 50 years, Goshen or South Bend or Elkhart is going to have the climate more similar to what today's Louisville is going to be like. So therefore, we should be planting more southern tree species because those are the ones that are going to survive in the future. And the argument against that is that we need to be not moving things around. We know the consequences of moving things around, but instead increasing our genetic diversity, planting not all the same cultivar, but having a wider gene pool, because we know from COVID was a good example of some people were very susceptible to it and some people weren't susceptible to it at all. And those who are not susceptible pass on their genes, and the same thing with trees. So this is real quick. We're out of time, Amanda, by the way, and so
Go faster.
You want to go with this one? Quick.
No, we can just go.
Okay.
Well, I mean, this is a tree that's native to the south central United States.
This was supposed to be a little audience participation, so we could go through this quickly. Like sweet gum, native to where?
I just told them.
You gave away the answer. Southeastern United States. So these are trees that we plant here. Bald cypress. This is another like really popular urban forestry tree, right? Southern U.S. It comes into the very southern tip of Indiana,
like
but this
Cookie
goes
Falls.
back to that thing where people are saying, well, we need to be planting these more southern species because those are the ones that are survived. I would argue we should
And
not
it's
be
called an
planting.
Indiana native, but it's
Right.
It just to the toe of the boot of the state. Very rarely.
Osage orange.
Oklahoma?
Narrow, limited range in Texas and Oklahoma. Imported, very hard wood, makes good fence posts and planted everywhere. Yellowwood. I said downtown Chicago, I've seen a bunch of yellowwoods planted. Makes apparently a good urban tree, but it has a very limited native range, and in Indiana it's only found in one spot. Who knows it?
Yellowwood,
Bloomington.
Brown County.
Yeah.
So yeah, Brown on a more wider distribution. But yeah, in fact, if you ever go down to Brown County State Park, there's a yellowwood right outside of the lodge there. Ginkgo, we already gave that one away earlier. That's from Southeast Asia. Little leaf linden. Whoa, I've been cutting down a bunch of these.
Someone said Europe. Yep.
Yeah, Europe, Western Europe. The blue spruce tree, we gave away that answer also, Western United States. And the hardy rubber tree. Ooh. Oh, boo. So this is another Asian tree. This is Holiday Park in Indianapolis. And we have over here, we can see there was a whole bunch of hardy rubber trees that they planted about 75 years ago along the street. And they have since been escaping into the forest there. And so they made the conscious decision to remove them all. But point is, it took like 75 years for them to jump cultivation and become a problem. This is a Japanese tree lilac, which is kind of the new darling forestry. We're not planting the Callery pear trees anymore, but instead we're planting these Japanese lilac trees. And you can see that there's one spot here in central Indiana where that's escaped. Is actually the same place at Holiday Park.
So what we're seeing now in the box stores, these are our future invasive species. So
This is,
we've yet to learn our lesson.
This is Bendix Drive in South Bend, where they just planted this whole row of Japanese lilac trees. Japanese Zelkova is another one we're seeing in a few places that has escaped cultivation. This is the downtown South Bend Library, and these are all Japanese Zelkovas planted along there. So you can find out, a lot of people ask the question, well, how do we know if it's native or not? The Biota of North America project, or BONAP, is a website where you can key in a plant, and it will give you a color coding to tell you whether it's native to that area or not. In this case, these thistles, we've got the invasive thistles. Bull thistle, Cirsium vulgare, is colored in and the pinks and the light blues as being exotic or invasive, and versus our native thistle, the swamp thistle, Cirsium muticum, is green.
Again?
Bonap.org, BONAP.org, Bonap. So we'll skip past these. So we're going to end up on this. So here's our house again. And by the way, I went back here to see if what they've actually done to it. And it was like 5 years later, it still looks exactly like this. So they haven't done any landscaping to it. I go by every year. I know they're going to do it. I know they're going to put this in. So,
Better, yeah.
so
Better
let's
than
say
doing it.
instead of putting that blue spruce in for privacy, we'll put in a native 9-bark shrub over there on the left-hand side. Now we can have a plant that's native and supporting ecology, and it's not the blue spruce. In addition to that, we can put in for height a pin oak. It's Quercus palustris. Instead of our calorie pear, we're going to put in a redbud tree in the front yard, which also has, I think, more attractive, in my opinion, than a calorie pear tree is. Instead of our red Crimson King maple, we're going to put in a tulip tree. State tree of Indiana, of course, and will give us lots of shade over there and some privacy screenings. Instead of our burning bush, we're going to put in spice bush, Lindera benzoin, and it's going to support spice bush swallowtail caterpillars and not be invasive. Instead of our butterfly bush, we're going to put in a native chokecherry over here, another super high wildlife value plant. And then instead of our hostas, we'll put in this little wildflower mix. Maybe we got the seed packets here at the seed swap today for some of those, right? And what do we have?
Full sun, so better choice than the hostas, if you remember. So that was.
And what do we have when we're done here? Yay. Look at this. I mean, we have something that's still beautiful. It's still, I think, just as attractive as that other landscape, except now we have one that's purely American and it's supporting American ecology. And then lastly, this is a very last slide.
But we didn't have, if you go back to that, you can also add an Indiana flag to this. You could even go as far, depending on how much research you've done, and put your city's flag on these species because they're native historically to your habitat.
Yeah, at least to the county. I mean, right. I think everything we see in this picture here is going to be native to like this region of Indiana. And then lastly, we threw this in really just at the very end. We're involved with an organization called Pollinator Partnership, which is a international organization that preaches pollinator conservation. And we are in the process of creating these landscaping or gardening menu recipe cards, I forget what we call them. Guides, but they're just like real simple things, like 5 or so plants that you can put into your yards or your gardens that will make the biggest difference to wildlife. And when Amanda and I did the ones for Indiana and Illinois, and we've got some other ones, it's still in the works. But when we were going through and we were trying to figure out, the idea was to find a plant that would support this insect, right? And that's kind of what you can see over here with the evening primrose, and it supports the white-lined sphinx moth, caterpillar, and moth. But what we found was that it was getting more and more difficult to try to find non-woody species that would support lots of wildlife. And so when we came back to the task force, we said, okay, here's our garden plants. We've got the spice bush, we've got a black walnut, we've got the violet and Virginia creeper, which is a vine, and the evening primrose. And one of the other task force members said, well, the walnut, that's not a gardening plant. I'm like, no, but it's more important than some of the perennials and annuals that we would be putting in. So my point is that these woody plants are super important to our ecosystems.
Yeah, and the pollinators are taking a lot of the press and the air in the room, and I guess we support it because yes, we can help pollinators, but it can get a little muddy because you look at butterfly bush, which is the one that we talked about earlier. Great nectar species, but it's not. It's like the breath mint for, as opposed to like the fluoride treatment for wildlife. It's doing one cursory thing, providing nectar, but it's not supporting the ecosystem as our natives would. So in our opinion, the pollinator kind of craze, I think, is important, but definitely kind of hedge that a little with your understanding that it is one part of what insects need, and that birds then will benefit from. So keep that in mind as you do that. And wildflowers are great, but it also it is playing a little bit into that aesthetic desire that we have, and that our HOAs expect, and that community, people kind of want out of us. But the structure, the ecological structure of your yards and of our parks, really are those woody species, those trees and shrubs.
Yeah, and I should probably clarify that on these gardening cards that the plants that we're talking about are the host plants, not the nectaring plants for these insects. So even though all of these pollinating insects can nectar from a variety of plants, they need to have their host plants to be able to make more butterflies and moths from, because that's what their larvae can eat, which is foliage instead of nectar.